average cost will be like these. I'm not going to make you derive all these again. Their marginal costs will be like these. And you have to graph to find the point where the marginal cost exceeds the average cost. And that will give you the firm's entry points and their supplies at those points. And you can do that, except the supplies are going to be exactly the same as above, except that they're going to enter at quantities 0, 5, 1, and 20 rather than at 0. So the way that you do this is we take the marginal cost, which is this linear thing. We've got this average cost that's coming down. We find the entry quantity, which is where this intersects, and the entry price, which is where it goes over to the vertical axis. Right? And that gives us individual firm supply curves that look like these. You see they enter at a positive quantity rather than entering at 0. And you add them up, and you get an industry supply that has all these discontinuities in it. OK, this can be a little bit annoying. A, because it makes it difficult to use calculus. B, and probably more importantly, what if we had a demand curve that cut through here at this point? What would be the equilibrium then? A little bit tough, right? In practice, though, this is not such a big problem. And one reason is that uncertainty smooths things out. So firms may have entry points, but we usually don't know exactly at what point they're going to be willing to enter. And this makes the average or expected supply curve smooth. The other thing is that if we only get these discontinuities because firms are a large part of the market. If firms were small relative to the whole market, then that uncertainty would already have smoothed everything out anyway, right? And if firms are large relative to the market, we don't think that we really have a competitive model. So in most competitive situations, it doesn't really matter that there are these discontinuity or entry points. They don't really cause much of a change in the overall smoothness of the demand supply curve. Yeah, go ahead.
So what does that mean that uncertainty smooths it out? How does that?
So what that means is that the expected supply is going to be smooth, even though the individual supplies will be have kinks or have gaps. And in fact, we'll do an example of that in just 1 second. So if you think about it, what would really happen in the world if the demand went through this point? Right? Well, this firm might enter, but it knows that it has a lot of pricing power, right? Because it's big enough to cause that sort of kink in industry supply. So it would reduce its quantity, raise the price, and earn enough profits to justify having entered there, right? So anytime you see one of these kinks and you say, or gaps, and you say, oh no, that's going to cause a problem, in a competitive market, you know that's not really the case. In fact, the fact that they're creating a significant gap indicates that the competitive model might not be the right way to think about this problem. Yeah, your name's Kevin, right?
Yeah.
Kevin.
In a scenario where there's kind of very little innovation, like for maybe popcorn stands or something, where kind of each vendor would have a similar fixed and marginal cost function, then wouldn't each of them kind of have the same entry point, and therefore every single one, even though there's a ton of them, would together create a kink in the industry supply?
Well, that's not actually going to be a problem, because as long as there's a lot of small guys, what can happen is, imagine that we were to stretch this way, way out, and then there are a bunch of people, each of whom is kinky there. What it'll look like is it'll fill in this gap, because it'll sort of be flat there, because you could have one guy enter, two guys enter, three guys enter. As long as each one of them is small relative to the industry as a whole, the thing is not actually a gap. It's a flat part.
Okay, but that's like assuming that they'll all enter at slightly different.
No, it's not actually. It's assuming that they could all enter at exactly the same price, but it's just that the number of them that enter would be sort of indeterminate and would be determined by demand, right?
Yeah, I see.
And in reality, they're all going to enter at slightly different prices. So there will be some ordering to it in general. But the point is that what matters is that they're small relative to the market, not that they actually have different behavior. OK, so let me try to give a simple example where uncertainty smooths things out and keeps us out of even Kevin's world. So there's still not going to be a gap as long as firms are small. But I claim that even Kevin's example, where everyone is coming in at that price, and so therefore there, as the price rises, would be a discontinuous change in demand, is not very realistic. And the reason is that firms' entry points are usually uncertain, and this tends to smooth things out. Okay, so imagine that there are 5 firms, and each is only going to produce 1 unit. But the price at which so you think if there's 5 firms and each is only producing 1 unit, you should have a very kinky demand, right? Kinks at each of the points at which those firms come in, and no movement in demand in between. But imagine that the distribution, from our perspective, of their entry point is given by some cumulative distribution function. Now, do you guys know what a cumulative distribution function is? Raise your hand if you know what a cumulative distribution function is. Not very many people. Well, so this is basically a representation of the chance that the firm will have an entry point that's below this particular value, right? And so this is saying that the chance that a firm has an entry point below p is 1 minus e to the negative I times p, right? So is Bob Chen here?
Yes.
Bob, what is the expected industry supply if this is the distribution of entry points?
It would just be the sum of all the supplies. So it would be like 5 minus the sum of e to the negative 5p's.
Yeah, so that's right. And the reason is that if we have a price that's equal to a certain level, the amount that's supplied is the probability, is the sum over all the firms of the probability that they've entered at this price, right? Because, and so this is the industry supply, which is something nice and smooth, even though each one of the firms is entering in this very discrete way, right? So the uncertainty about the distribution of firms makes, from society's perspective, the expected supply be this smooth function. So this is the example. Each of the individual firms has an expected supply curve, which is actually the smooth thing. Even though at for any given value that they end up having for their fixed costs, it would look like a jump. The expectation from society's perspective is the smooth thing, and adding it up, you get this very smooth industry expected supply curve. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is basically saying that we don't expect that the suppliers will be perfectly rational, almost.
Well, I guess the way to think about it is that from the perspective of the consumer or from the perspective of society, don't know exactly what the firm's entry points are. So even though each firm has some particular entry point, and that would, if I knew it exactly, create discontinuities in the supply curve, in reality, I'm so uncertain about exactly where they're going to enter that from my perspective, it's a smooth supply curve. So if I think, imagine I'm a government board and I'm saying, if I set a price of 2, how much demand am I going to get, supply am I going to get? Well, I can't really say exactly because I don't know at what point the firms would be willing to supply. But on average, I expect to get about a supply of 2. And in many problems, when we talk about supply curves or demand curves, we'll be thinking about them in cases where that's really the right way to think about demand. Like, if you're a company and you set a certain price, it's not really that people are going to smoothly reduce their demand as you raise your price. It's really that, when I set a particular price, every person is saying, is it worth it to me to get this or not? And there's some people out there who, by raising the price, you change their calculus and they say it's not worth getting it. OK. So in all of these pictures, firms earn positive profits or rents. And Kevin, what is it that determines the size of the profits that a firm is going to earn? We talked a little bit about this last time. What do you think, both based on what we said last time and intuitively, is going to determine the size of profits that any given firm is going to earn?
Well, I mean, from last time, those profits are just the average cost type, or it's the price times the quantity minus the average cost.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
but think about a market. What when you see a firm being very profitable, what does that mean about that firm relative to other firms?
It means it's being a lot more efficient.
Yeah, because the price is being determined by everybody's marginal cost, whereas your average cost is determined by how efficient you are. So it's really how efficient you are relative to everyone else, as well as how much you can stay at a large quantity more efficient than everybody else is, basically, right? This is the area of the supply curve, but because other firms help determine the prices, it's really how efficient you are relative to other people. So there are two basic sources of rents under competition. One is that your marginal product allows you to stretch farther. That is, it doesn't start increasing too quickly, right? And second, that it starts at a level that's much lower than other people are. Now, did I tell you guys the story about stress in the last lecture? No. OK. So one way to think about this is that everyone's marginal cost is going to be set equal to the price. Right? Now, what does it mean that someone has a high ratio of their marginal cost to their average cost? That means that their marginal product is much lower than their average product is. Right? Which I think is a very good definition of what it means to be stressed out. Right? You're stressed out if you are at the margin much less productive than you would be overall. Right? So someone who's just unproductive, if they're not very productive, they're not stressed out. Right? It's someone who's being driven to the point where they're much less productive than they are on average who's stressed out. And what that says is that people who are earning high profits are, by the very nature of competitive markets, going to be stressed out. So in fact, stress is an indication of the fact that you're successful. And I think that you'll find that in your lives, the more successful you are, the more people you have knocking on your door trying to get you to do things for them, right? And driving you to the point where you're not actually more productive doing that extra thing than anybody else, right? So, and we see that in the world all the time. So, the most successful doctors are deluged with patients. The best restaurants have huge lines to get into them, right? Talented people are constantly turning people down for offers to do things. Stress is an indication of success. OK. So now, a natural economic question that lies behind a lot of the stuff you read in your book is that if one person is making profits, shouldn't that incentivize other people to try to want to enter, to imitate them, to make profits just like they're doing? And that is a very classical idea. So the idea is that in the long run, people will be able to enter, imitate existing firms, and earn the same profits as them. And that will compete down prices so that firms don't make any profit. In this view, it's only short-term advantages that allow firms to make profits. So probably the most classic example of this was the California gold rush. So in the California gold rush, there was like, oh my God, there's money laying around. Let's go pick it up. And immediately, the place gets completely deluged to the point where most people probably made negative profits on the whole journey because that